I'd like to welcome everyone to the 2021 GW Graduate School for Education and Human Development Pride Forum. This is the Pride event that the community at GW puts on for and in association with its LGBTQ community, those members that identify within the GW and the larger DC area as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer or questioning, depending on how you want to use the Q. We started this last year to have sort of an annual event along with the commemoration of Pride. And as many of you know, that Pride commemorates the Stonewall riots that happened in 1969. It's often reminded that MLK said that a riot is the language of the unheard. And in acknowledging our past and the oppression that this community has served, we also hope to acknowledge the achievements of the present and have a conversation today that advances us towards the future. And for that purposes, without delay, I will like to turn it over to Dr. Harvey Peters, one of our recent hires on the tenure track here at GSEHD and our counseling and human development. And Dr. Peters and his crew will put on the Pride Forum with the title today, Queer Adolescent Dating, Relationships and Sexual Health, the Role of School, Family, and Community. I'd like to thank Dr. Peters and the entire group for their efforts, and happy Pride. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wright. We're excited and very grateful all of our panelists here today. If we want to move to the next slide, that would be fantastic. And we'll do brief introductions where each of our panelists will briefly introduce kind of who they are and their connection to the queer community. So as Dr. Wright indicated, my name is Dr. Harvey Charles Peters, and I'm an assistant professor and queer scholar within the Counseling and Human Development Department.
Hi, I am Esette Negussie. I am a recent graduate of the GW Master's program in Clinical Mental Health Counseling, and I'm really excited to be here.
Hi, my name is Leen Zorc. I'm a second-year master's student in the Clinical Mental Health Counseling program.
Hi, happy Pride, everybody. I'm Katherine Hurley, she, her, hers. I'm a doctoral candidate here in GSEHD at GW, and just delighted to be here and get to communicate with everybody about this today. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Darren Vance, he, him, his pronouns, and I'm Executive Director of Rainbow Families here in Washington, D.C. Happy Pride, and I'm happy to be here.
Hi, I apologize. I'm having trouble connecting my video here, but I'm Dillie. I am a professional counselor with Compassionate Counseling based out of Pittsburgh, PA, and my pronouns are they, them, their.
Once again, thank you to all our panelists today. We will begin, if we want to move to the next slide, thank you. We will begin today with a brief 35-minute presentation, which has way too much material, and I'm happy to, I like to over-prepare, and if anyone would like access to it, I'm happy to share that, and so that's my intention on over-preparing. But I want to thank all of our panelists for their wonderful expertise that they will share today after our brief little presentation. So today I just wanted to begin by grounding our conversation in some queer youth data, some quotes from different research articles that have addressed different dating, intimacy, and sexual health issues for queer individuals. Within the literature on dating and sexuality and sexual health and wellness, particularly for youth, there is not a lot of literature at large, and there's a huge dearth of literature in research pertaining to queer adolescents in a singular form, let alone in an intersectional form that includes race and disability and nationality and linguistic capacities. And so I just wanted to begin by kind of with those quotes and framing that today. And to note that Pride initially began, as many of you know, as a point of riot and disruption. And although it has become, there has been a commodification of the Pride process, its origins is in social justice advocacy. Next slide. So I almost never hear about LGBT inclusive, much less about trans inclusive sex education in schools. I just got done taking a quarter of health at my school, and there's lots of homophobia and trans exclusion. When the curriculum / my teachers do mention other sexual orientations, they never talk about gender identity. It's always talked about as a hypothetical lifestyle that no one in the classroom lives. The sex education I've received has never applied to my body and my sexuality like it has to straight and cis students. Next slide. I really wish anyone, would cover trans dating honestly. Not even Tumblr has anything honest to say about it. All I've really gotten from it is the whole be safe part and just don't, because hardly anyone wants to date you anyways, and if they do, they're a chaser. The last time I've checked, there's no guides on how to date someone with minimal risk while being trans. Next slide. I pretty much had one same-sex encounter in the whole of high school, and it was weird, and I was really too drunk, and it was with a dude who I was really close friends with but wasn't very attracted to. It happened because I was super wasted. I didn't have any positive development in terms of an actual sense of having sexual contact with dudes that was positive and enjoyable. And I was just examining sexuality at all, except for occasionally when I would get drunk and kiss girls who were my friends, which was pretty fun, but also confusing. Next slide. We can actually probably skip to probably 2 more slides. Thank you. I think this is why it's important when we're talking about sexual health, and one of the reasons why I keep bringing up diverse content up and saying is you have to talk about holistic sexual health. Sex as, like you said, an emotional, spiritual, and physical experience. Next slide. I think we can skip this one as well. And one more. I got a little overboard. Okay, so the presentation outline. So I just wanted to begin by grounding, since I do not have any queer adolescents here, and I like to be very cautious about presenting on communities, even though I identify as a queer gay man. I myself am not in my adolescent phase of being. So I want to begin by providing a brief little overview of sexual education in the United States, provide just a brief little overview and name a few different theories and frameworks that can be used to examine queer youth dating, intimacy, and sexual health. And for queer youth, I do mean gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, asexual individuals, pansexual, and demisexual. And we will not unpack that all today. However, I do encourage you, if you are not familiar with one of those terms, to do some of your own kind of research in regards to that. We're going to talk about 4 different types of queer intimate relationships, a little bit about school community settings, sexual health, interpersonal violence, the legal landscape, and then we're going to have our wonderful panel discussion and some few minutes for time for any questions that we might have today. Next slide. So considering sexual education in the United States, until about late 1800s, early 1900s, sexual education was actually something that was not really taught in schools and was not taught by medical providers or health professionals. Rather, it was seen as being a caregiver where a parent or guardian kind of authority and responsibility to provide sexual education to their children. And so in the early to mid 1900s, we began to see a shift in sexual education, and it began to be grounded in the medical model, biology, eugenics, and the social hygiene movement and white Christian values. So this really was an effort to increase white, heterosexual, able-bodied, and middle-class birth rates in America because they were kind of plateauing or decreasing. Next slide. As one might also expect, the movement was also heavily influenced by racist and majority concerns regarding that said decline of white family and white family values, while there was an increase in birth rates within communities of color, particularly Black and African American families. So we can see that part of sex education and how it's inextricably linked to some of the racist ideologies and history of the United States. So sexual orientation was primarily taught through a medical and health lens, through a medical and biological lens. This did not include culturally responsive practice. It really doesn't include it today, nor strength-based or sexual wealth and wellness lens. And so we can begin to see kind of the majority really influencing and using it to guide and structure the United States based on the dominant culture. Next slide. So between 1920 and 1950, we began to see education started to target sexual delinquency. And so sexual delinquency at the time was defined as premarital sex, sexual assault, and homosexuality. And I use that term because that was the term that was used at that point in time of our history. And so the exclusion and harmful education really focused on indoctrinating youth with appropriate sexuality and appropriate sexual behavior. So we can begin to see how this can cause harm and not ground or provide queer persons within that large continuum with any type of education. Next slide. We're not really going to discuss these today, but here are some of the more current sexual funds and policies that really do dictate sexual education. And so we can see through the AOUM and the SRAE that these are basically abstinence-only sexual education programs. And there are some other education programs, but sexual abstinence-only programs account for about 33% of the overall funding for sexual health in the United States, which we'll see on our next slide. So in 2017, this is just a brief little overview. And so you can see with the orange and yellow that these really account for abstinence-only education for sexual education. And so we can see both the lack of education coupled with the lack of inclusivity and lack of representing queerness as in a positive lens. And so other social factors such as the diagnostic manual and its identifying queerness as a mental health related issue and looking at the rise of how Western colonial, particularly Christianity, began to influence how queerness and queer behavior was presented in the media. If you've seen any Disney movie, you'll know that many villains in Disney are based on queer individuals. So we can begin to see the socialization, indoctrination of queer individuals within this country. Next slide. So today, briefly, we're going to focus on ecological and socialization theory. But there are many different theories that you can use to begin to examine queer dating, sexuality, intimacy, and sexual health. And so ecological theory, socialization theory, attachment theories, identity development models are great tools and frameworks that have begun to unpack in different bodies of literature some of these different concepts. And I would be regretful if I wouldn't say that critical theories also provide an important platform to understand, analyze, and really critique from a social justice lens and an anti-oppressive lens some of the history of queerness in this country. So queer theory, intersectionality, Black feminism, critical race theory, which does need to be taught in schools, and discrit are some of those frameworks that should be used. Next slide. So I just wanted to provide a brief little number in terms of statistics. So in 2020, Gallup did a poll of about 1,800 million people on their affectional and sexual orientation. It did begin at 18 years old. 1823 is kind of what they defined as adolescence. With that, 1 in 6 or 15.9% of all the people who identified in that age group identified as queer. And so we're beginning to see that this is a major increase from 2012, from 2006. So looking at different times which Gallup had collected information, that we're seeing an increased number of individuals, particularly youth, begin to identify within the queer spectrum. And within that, many of these queer youth identify as multi-affectional, which is someone who is attracted to multiple types of genders or personalities, so bisexual or pansexual, which was then followed by more monosexual, gay or lesbian individuals. So this marks the highest rate of queer persons identifying in the United States history. Next slide. So I briefly want to talk about socialization theory, as I think it's really important to understand dating, sexual health, and sexual wellness through how we teach children and how that shows up for adolescents within that context. And so we'll talk about it further in just a moment, but you'll see agents such as caregivers, friends, peers, the temporal process of childhood versus adulthood, and one's own spatial locations as really informative for looking at how we teach or don't teach about these different concepts. Next slide. So I'm going to briefly outline 5 different types of socialization. So one is primary socialization. So for any of you who've taken a human development class or an attachment-based class or work with children, you'll kind of know that the values, norms, and behaviors are really displayed in a home, parent, or guardian. So looking at the primary caregivers in that context. And so we begin to see that parents are beginning to socialize and teach their children, even often unintentionally, about what are dating scripts, how do they engage with their partner, what's appropriate, what are the different types of persons that they're exposed to through television and at home. And so we can see that as the primary socialization that queer people face. And we'll talk more about the primary focus of what that is in a moment. We also will see in secondary socialization, which is more of the school community or peers, which is at an adolescence phase, a really important phase where the primary socialization becomes less present for many individuals, and secondary socialization, their peers play a larger role. And so seeing how their schoolmates, their peers, what's showing up in curriculum begin to really influence the types of behaviors, how they show up within their own space. And so we can see how, depending upon how queerness is presented within the school community, accepted or not accepted, that will also really influence how queer people show up. Next slide. Next, you have developmental socialization. So this is really the process of learning and developing different skills. And so this is the asking people out. This is beginning to enact some of the social scripts that from your primary and secondary socialization that you begin to see. Next, you have anticipatory socialization, which is really about the rehearsing for future relationships. And so this is where many queer adolescents who are beginning to explore their sexuality are beginning to practice. Maybe go on dates, ask people out, go on different social media apps and begin to engage with different persons. And so at this page, developmental, anticipatory, and secondary socialization are really central to queer adolescents' dating, sexuality, and sexual health. Lastly is the process of socialization, which is the rejection of previous behaviors and patterns and the development of new one. And so, for example, for many queer youth, this can be addressing some of their own isms, whether that's internalized homophobia, internalized racism, some of the different socializations that they've been experienced to try to develop an identity that is congruent with who they are. So I share that because I think these are really central to the queer experience. Next slide. When understanding queer socialization, I think it's really important to understand that not for all, but for many queer individuals, particularly youth, they are predominantly socialized in the majority culture. That is white, heterosexual, able-bodied culture in which there's certain values and practices and scripts in ways that we teach people to be sexual beings or not sexual beings. And so to really understand that for many queer individuals, their initial socialization is not in queer culture. It is predominantly in heterosexual culture norms and values. Next slide. So following that socialization, the literature talks about, and we're beginning to see some differences between generations, but more historically, queer individuals were socialized when they came out and had opportunities to engage with, whether that be at a bar or community setting. And so that was really when queer people began to be exposed to and socialized within what is gay culture, what is dating scripts in queer community, what is sexual health and wellness look like in the queer community. And so we're seeing now that for not all, but many queer youth are beginning to come out younger or have more queer experiences at a younger age. Next slide. I already talked about this. The last thing I'll say is that often when queer people are taught about the kind of queer community, it's often like presented as a monolith culture. So like, here is queer people. But as we see on this panel today, there are quite a few different identities and sexual or affectional orientations and gender identities that are represented within that community. Next slide. And so some of the literature talks about, first, as I just mentioned, you're introduced to the general queer population in terms of your own socialization, followed by the identity-specific subgroup. So trans, asexual, intersex, pansexual, bisexual. And so that your first real indoctrination or socialization is into that. From there, queer individuals begin to find subgroups. So femme, leather, maybe they're a parent. So beginning to find the different sub-communities within the queer community. And so we can see how that scaffolded process builds to maybe find their own space or place, or really begin to inform where they find a sense of belonging. And that many of these are based upon dominant identities as well. So we can see that many of the queer values and cultures, anyone's familiar with what just happened at Nellie's in DC recently, we can see it's based upon attractive, fit, gay, white, cis able-bodied perspectives. Next slide. We can skip the next slide for. So I also want to kind of address a caveat, which is we're beginning to see increased number of queer families emerging in the United States. So in 2015, there was data that indicated that there were between 2 and basically 4 million children being raised by queer parents, and over 200,000 were being raised by same-gender couples. And so we're beginning to see that there are queer individuals raising queer children who do provide them with the opportunity to socialize and gain positive socialization messages about queerness and sexuality and sexual health from that regard. And so and we're beginning to see increased acceptance, and people provide access to affirmative spaces for younger queer youth. And so I also want to present that there are positive messages and opportunities for socialization if one is provided the privilege and opportunity to grow up in a family or structure. Next slide. So traditionally in kind of queer dating and sexuality, it has been identified that queer mentorship plays a central role in passing down knowledge, practices, social scripts, queer community history, different facets or community norms. And so that was often by a younger queer person developing a relationship with an older, more experienced queer person, whether sexual or non-sexual. And that was how knowledge was traditionally passed down before the widespread of technology, such as Instagram and Twitter and Reddit and Facebook. So I just wanted to provide that history, even though we're beginning to see that shift. Next slide. And so to understand that that still plays a force in today's culture. And so these are really essential relationships, having the ability to find affirmative queer persons, affirmative spaces, whether that be in education, whether that be in the community, whether that be online, and that queer knowledge is often not passed down in the traditional sense of heteronormative standards, but passed down through access to queer persons or spaces. And so it becomes really important that queer youth have the opportunity to engage with said queer spaces to begin to learn and understand some of the history and culture of the queer community. Next slide. So over the past decade, we began to see a huge shift in the role and influence of technology. So it has been noted that traditional uses of queer spaces are becoming less and they're being declined. So my assumption is that many queer youth who are 15, 17 aren't going out to queer bars in that context. But we're beginning to see that there are less queer spaces. They're finding that many of the queer spaces are becoming to be more integrated, and some even queer spaces are becoming just allies to the queer community. And so we're beginning to see that shift and see that queer youth are utilizing social media and technology as their main source for connection, support, and socialization into the queer community. Next slide, please. So with that, queer spaces historically have been identified as being really important for socialization, identity development, connection and belonging, community integration, enclaves of and coping with marginalization and subjugation of the queer community. Conversely, modern technology is now providing increased access to queer persons' content and spaces, as I've already mentioned. So next slide. With these kind of changes, we're beginning to see that those who are exploring or have not disclosed are using this instead of their school, family, community settings. And so we'll see a slide a little bit later, but there was a study done of a virtual ethnographic study that examined particularly queer youth of color and how they navigated the intersections of their gender, their Blackness, and their affectional orientation, and for some socioeconomic status, and found that public forms of social media such as Facebook or Instagram wasn't a space in which they could access or be out or be their authentic self for a variety of different reasons. Rather, that they began to really use other spaces such as Reddit or more anonymous blogs and platforms that allowed them to explore, engage, and discuss with people without having to actively identify for a variety of personal and safety-related reasons. So I wanted to identify that. Next slide. So we're beginning to see not only are they using apps such as TikTok and Tumblr, but they're also beginning to use hookup apps, Grindr, Jack'd, Her, thirst, scissor, plenty of fish to make these connections and to find ways to engage, make friends, to engage in sexual exploration. Next slide. We can go to the next slide. So although queer people are accessing and utilizing social media, it is also important to understand that this virtual space can also be very triggering and harmful. That there is, the extent literature talks about, this could be a place of significant harm and interpersonal violence, so bullying, harassment, leading to physical or sexual abuse, and many experiences of racism, ableism, and genderism. Next slide. Through that, queer youth are also reporting high rates of harassment, doxing, hacking, and trolling. So many of you know harassment is. I was new to doxing. So this is really where people publish for personal reasons the passwords, the information, or personal information to someone. We're also beginning to see people's profiles getting hacked or people getting in trolling. So this is causing mental health related issues for queer youth. And so we're seeing that connection and socialization is happening online, and with that, there's also a lot of toxicity embedded in the system of how they're beginning to navigate that. Next slide. So this is the kind of study that I was mentioning. So I'll just read this quote really quickly. In Cho's study using cybernetic autoethnography for queer use of color, they said a space reported that blogs were a safe space where they could let loose, express more intimate and deep emotions, did not feel pressure of constant surveillance. They could learn more about how to make sense of the world around them and its various antagonisms, including sophisticated vocabulary regarding race, gender, and sexuality politics. So it's not only a space in which they're learning about queerness, it's a space where they're learning about critical queerness and how to challenge and disrupt and engage in advocacy and problematize some of their own experiences. And so although it can be a space of harm, it can also be a space of growth and development. Next slide. We can skip that slide as well. So as this is the ecological series, I would be remiss if I didn't include Bronfenbrenner. So we're briefly going to talk a little bit about Bronfenbrenner's original theory and its adaptation through the different social ecological systems for kind of queer dating, sexual health, and wellness. Next slide. I do want to add a caveat that there is the PPCT model, which is the more current model. So we're just going to be speaking about two different aspects, or really one aspect of the PPCT model as it has been adapted and evolved and is beginning to see increased research. So I just, as a scholar, I felt the need to make sure I provide the most up-to-date information. Next slide. We can do one more slide, please. Thank you. So we begin to see as the individual. So we're beginning to see this is a queer person's gender identity, gender expression, affectional orientation, sexuality, race, their own resilience and personal identifications. And so these are really their own norms, labels, and values that we're beginning to see as an individual. So first beginning to understand queer dating, sexual youth becomes really important to understand them as an individual and the very aspects intersectionally of their identity. Next slide. We also becomes really important to understand their microsystem. So looking at the immediate environment and relationship compositions for queer persons. So this could be, what are the number of partners they have? What are the relationship parameters and sexualities, and how does that fit into their own kind of community or relationship? Is it monogamous, committed, polyamorous, open relationships? We're seeing that embedded in queer relationships, there's not as much as the heteronormative monogamous, but there can be a variety of different relationship parameters that can be identified, as well as relational and sexual roles. Do they identify as a femme queen, fluid, masculine, dominant, versatile, bottom? Are they into kink, oral, other roles? And so really beginning to understand what is queer sexuality and what does that encompass for those dating, and how are they understanding that? Next slide. You also begin to see the mesosystem. So interactions amongst the person's microsystem, immediate environment, and other relational compositions. So this is looking at how are peer and familial persons reacting to their sexuality and relationships. How are they understanding it through an intersectional lens? So looking at spiritual and religious lens, racial and ethnic, geographic and political. What is the knowledge or understanding of their level of outness? Is it disclosed, undisclosed? Do people understand relationships as friends, but not more. So these can be helpful to explore and unpack some of the relational dynamics. Next slide. Exosystem. So beginning to look at the interplay of one or more settings. And so this can include how people access affirmative and queer spaces. So are there queer affirmative counseling centers, queer affirming K-12 education systems, or sex education programs, intimate partner violence programs, homeless shelters, as well as what are the state and local policies, and how is the school environment, culture, and politics? Are they accepting? There are schools that don't allow queer people who are dating to purchase the same ticket. And so these can really have an impact on dating, sexual health, and the overall wellness of queer persons. Next slide. The second to last of the macro system, beginning to look at really the larger social ecological, macro-oriented forms of influence. So how is queerness being portrayed in books, magazines, television? What are politicians saying online about queer relationships, trans identities, Black trans persons' experiences? And so these really begin to shape and influence the norms, expectations, and experiences of relationships and sexuality. And then beginning to look at some of those social cultural messages that queer persons and couples are beginning to experience. Homophobia, heterosexism, are they sexualized? Is identified as being sinful? Next slide. Lastly, the chronosystem. So looking at the interaction between a person and their environment over a period of time. So you can look at relational milestones. Is it their first sexual encounter? Is it they've been dating for a year? Is it at first date? Also beginning to look at historical factors for queerness, so civil rights movement, Stonewall, the DSM, laws and regulations, and then lastly, the various factors of age. So looking at the different partners' age, their age differences, their time spent in relationship, and all these can provide helpful tools to begin to understand queer dating and sexuality in a queer-centered and specific way. Next slide. We're not going to be discussing those, but I wanted to, for those of you who wanted to know more, there are various queer identity development models. Unfortunately, many of them are linear. And I'm not a huge fan of them, but I think they are important to begin to understand some of the identity development experiences and issues and processes. So there include queer, gender expansive, and trans related queer identity development models. And here are some of the more popular ones. I think we can probably skip 2 or 3 slides. One more, please. So I briefly want to outline, there has been some kind of research on what is unique about kind of queer dating and sexuality and relationships, and how can we begin to understand them. And so Diamond, who is a social psychologist, has done a lot of important work for queer dating, sexuality and relationships, and sexual health. And so in her seminal work, she began to identify these 4 different types of relationships. Next slide. So one is dating relationships. So these are described as differing from sexual or romantic. These often are very symbolic moments for adolescents that capture the romanticization of kind of dating and what that looks like. And so this is usually the process of really just beginning to date and have a romantic mutual kind of attraction and interest in one another. So just the act of dating. We could skip 2 slides. Next, we have sexual relationships. So these are relationships that are primarily focused on kind of sexual exploration and experiences with 2 or more peers that is over a period of time. So these aren't identified as hookups, rather maybe friends with benefits might be a better term. And so these are really just mutual attraction in relationships for queer people, where they begin to engage in sexual encounters that are focused on pleasure seeking and exploration. And so that at this age for queer youth, that is the second type of queer relationships. You can skip 2 slides. Ooh, sorry, I lied. I think you have to go back 1. Romantic relationships. So these are just traditional relationships that extend over a period of time. So these can be monogamous or open, but these are really an opportunity where people engage in kind of romantic dating. And so this is where there's some type of commitment, noting that commitment can look different depending on the kind of the queer adolescent couple. And then the next slide, please. Lastly is passionate friendships. So in the literature, it really talks about this being very prevalent for lesbian women, as well as they're seeing some emergence in trans and gender expansive persons. So these are relationships that mimic some of the non-sexual, but also sometimes sexual components between a relationship, whether that be romantic or sexual. But there's no type of commitment, and there's often a friendship. And so there's a groundedness and affection, and sometimes can be levels of possessiveness, trust, dependency. And so it can be where queer people begin to maybe develop more intimate and passionate friendships that resemble and look like traditional dating, but don't have some of those same kind of definitions. And sometimes can result in feelings being projected at someone and not reciprocated. And so these were also a type of dynamics for many queer youth that were identified in her work. Next slide. I think I'm going to move this pretty quickly. We can skip this slide. So just to name that within queer kind of family, school, community settings, that queer youth have very few dating scripts. So some queer youth have reported really enjoying not have to attend to the heteronormative or binary social scripts that they've seen and be socialized with. And like the opportunity to explore what dating and sexuality and sexual wellness can look like for them. However, some queer youth have also identified this as a part of an issue of not having proper scripts and norms to understand, how do I go about asking someone out? How do I engage in sex? How do I engage in dating? Who pays? So trying to look at some of their own socialization and not kind of knowing what to do in terms of the dating scripts and understanding the similarities and differences. And so next slide. We can skip this slide. So as queer acceptance has increased, queer space for queer has rendered increasingly commodified, heteronormative, and exclusionary for those who are not within the dominant culture. And so I think that becomes really important, that queer youth of color report kind of double experiences of isms and microaggressions that occurs outside of the queer community as well as inside the queer community. And so looking at, many people are like, oh, queerness is maybe a safe space or a space in which queer people can find connection and safety. But the literature is very clear that people who are not within the dominant culture, within queer culture, do not experience those same rates of safeness. And we've even begin to see increased rates of tone policing, identity policing, actual policing of queer people of color, as well as there has even been some emerging research of looking at how queer, homeless, and transgender youth of color are being treated in communities and the policing of these persons without a lot of support and the harm that's coming from that. Next slide. So I think I've touched about this, but these isms are all embedded within the queer culture. So it is a microcosm of the larger society at large. So I just really wanted to highlight that because I think it's important to understand the differences within the community. Next slide. So there are various platforms and research out there. And so I encourage you all to look at the GLSEN School Climate Report, which has lots of great statistics on bullying, sexual assault, and violence. And not that they are positive statistics, but they are very informative statistics that can assist you in understanding the queer and all that encompasses experiences in a K-12 setting. Next slide. So sexual health and wellness, what is that? So it's a sexual, it's defined as sexual state of mental, physical, social well-being in relations to one's sexuality. And so this requires positive, respectful approach and understanding of sexuality and sexual relationships, as well as a possibility of having pleasure and safe, consensual sexual experiences free of coercion, discrimination, and violence. Next slide. We can go to the next slide. So within the queer community, in terms of the sexual education, a lot of the literature talks about it is really geared towards gay men, bisexual men, and women. It's very focused on penetration and does not cover, when it doesn't cover or include queer-oriented forms of sexual education, that is very focused on those particular communities. So there is a very heavy focus on the act of penetration in sexual education. And so I think that's really important to understand for if you have transgender expansive, asexual, intersexual, and even lesbians, of the lack of sexual education, even within this queer sexual education, and what that means for them, and exposure and preparedness to engage in dating and sex. Next slide. We can go to the next slide. I found this to be a very helpful quote. So reflecting on their own transition process, a trans participant described masculine, feminine, male, female self-images that they sought to attain. And so looking at some people, it isn't necessarily binary of masculine or femininity. And so they said, I never really identified with my breast as something that made me sexy or something that made me me. I feel so more connected to my body. I used to sort of look at and be like, I'm not sure what looks good or what looks bad, because there's so many things that I just don't feel right. And yeah, I feel so much more in my body. I feel so much more touchable and sexual. I like the way I look. And so looking at some of their expansion and development and having the opportunity to have a level of congruence with their gender identity and body and feeling sexy and feeling sexual and having the opportunity to engage in sexual relationships and acts that are congruent and feel authentic and congruent to them and their identity. Next slide. So here was a study that really, I know many of you can't see it, but they kind of explored sexual education for queer and trans youth. And so it talked about different categories of what was covered. So where source of sexual education? So school, family, online resources. What were some of the different types of websites they were using? So they were using YouTube, webcomics, message boards. What were their thoughts about it? So they talked about pornography, and transphobia. They talked about the level of trust. And so there's a lot of distrust in some of the scientific and more heteronormative and cis-oriented forms of research and training that was out there. They felt that there was a lot of key missing information, such as masturbation, gender identity exploration, consent, how to have sex, exploring sexual desires, kinks, safe sex, how to communicate your sexual needs and pleasures, how to communicate negative experiences. And so we're beginning to see what is covered out there, but there's a large body of queer youth are identifying that there is not a sufficient sexual education in the United States. Next slide. Another study kind of looked at parent-child sex education and what was happening. And so you can see, it's on my left, you can see what parents talked about versus not talked about. So you see virginity, genitals, social pressures, privacy, wet dreams, first loves, sex and religion, abstinence were common themes that queer youth were exposed to in kind of their discussions around sexuality, versus what wasn't covered was condoms, kissing, sexual abuse, STIs, pornography, queerness, safe sex, masturbation, HIV and AIDS, sexual orientations, anal sex, vaginal sex. And so we're really beginning to see huge aspects of queerness not being covered both in schools, but also within the home environment. Next slide. And so really there's a need for a lot of sexual education related to these various types of topics for queer people to be prepared to be sexual beings, but also address the many sexual violences that queer persons report, particularly as you begin to look at the intersections of identity. Next slide. If you're looking for some queer-related literature on sexual health and wellness, here are a few different resources that I think are very helpful and can be informative for everyone. Next slide. We're not going to go through these really quickly, but I found them to be very adorable and helpful. These are examples of queer-related literature that's been, or sexual literature that's been queered. And so it talks about communication and consent. Next slide. It talks about anal sex, and so it treats all these different sexual experiences as ingredients. So you have servings and ingredients and substitutions and notes and steps, and it always begins with consent. And so these are just some examples of queer-related sexual education that exists out there for different types of sexual exploration. So here you have anal sex. We'll go to the next slide. You have rimming and the ingredients and steps for that. You have next slide. Sexting. We can go to the next slide. Fingering, next slide. This does feel interesting to share in a educational platform, and I still think it's very important. Outer course and masturbation, some of the scripts and processes that and what that can look like. Next slide. Bondage. Next slide. And so I just want to indicate that if you're not familiar with PrEP, PrEP is very essential. It can be very harmful on the liver. But we can move to the next slide. It is shown to be highly effective when taken daily in the pill form. And so it's given to people who are shown to not be HIV positive. And it is also shown in injection to be as effective, albeit not as effective as the daily taken pill. And it does not prevent against STIs, rather it's a preventative mechanism for HIV. Next slide. And I think it's really just important to understand that being undetectable is equivalent of not being able to pass HIV. And so undetectable equals untransmittable. And so there's a lot of misnomers and miseducation related to HIV and in queer sexual education. So PrEP is an important milestone for queer sexuality. And at this point, I'm going to just ask for to skip to the end so we can move on to our discussion and panel. I encourage you all to go to HRC's website. I had some information about some of the different queer affirmative youth laws and policies in Delaware, Pennsylvania, Washington, D.C., Virginia, and Maryland. And so on their website, you can go to the Human Rights Campaign and look at what are some of the current laws and policies that are affirmative or non-affirmative and harmful to queer youth. And so DC scored very high, but I think that's really important. So at this time, I wanted to thank all of you for attending, and we're going to transition to our panel discussion with our panelists. So thank you very much for being here. How this is going to unfold is that we've developed some questions that I'm going to open up, and not every person has to answer each question, but rather you can share a little bit about your experiences, knowledge, and training related to each of these different questions to provide, to build upon some of the literature that we've discussed today. So the first question that I'm going to ask our wonderful panelists that you've all met, when you were an adolescent, what were some of the relevant socialization, social scripts, or education related to dating, sexuality, and sexual health? And when talking about it, if you feel comfortable, if you can also be willing to share a little bit about your identity, and so that people can understand some of the strengths and limitations for different communities within the queer community.
I'm happy to go first, if that's all right. Darren Vance again, he, him, and I am a gay man, and I probably represent the eldest member of the panel. So my own socialization and scripts and all that are from the Stone Age. I will also add that having a queer 16-year-old child who is also a person of color is very interesting in kind of contrasting what my experiences were versus what their experiences are currently. You know, some of the social scripts and things at school, especially, and at church and all that, you know, being called a faggot in the hallways, you know, essentially living in the nurse's lounge or the school office during recess and sporting events and things like that, just to avoid the humiliation. You know, I remember a cartoon that what was in the school office that said, you know, it's a bad day when your kid says he wishes Anita Bryant would mind her own business. And for those of you who don't know who Anita Bryant is, you can look it up. But, you know, these subtle and not so subtle messages were very clear, and I won't even get started on church. But then coming out in the early 80s, you know, being gay was a death sentence. And so the act of coming out to a parent or to a best friend or anything like that, immediately the next question was, do you have AIDS? You know, I can remember things like wanting to ask questions about intimacy right after coming out. And for example, speaking with one of my parents and just having them kind of shudder at the you could see them visualizing what I was trying to talk and get advice on. So I just think that's at least my representation, and indeed the first introduction to dating or sexual health came about, as anonymous sex kind of, there was no map, there was no roadmap to navigate any of that. So that was my experience.
Thank you, Darren. Reminds me of a documentary I recently watched where they talked about many Black and queer leaders died throughout the civil rights movement, and so we've seen we're now seeing a lot of queer and Black leaders begin to emerge, but there had been many deaths, differences, but deaths in these communities, and how that's impacted the queer community at large. So thank you.
I'm happy to go next. Oh, sorry,
Go ahead.
Leen, do you want
No,
to
you go
reset?
first.
Okay. So I'm Esette again. I use any pronouns. I use words like queer, genderqueer, lesbian, to describe my gender and sexuality. And this question is really interesting for me because I'm also Ethiopian. I'm Black, and those intersecting identities has really affected my socialization, my experience in queerness, and in relationships. I'll be frank, I don't know the word for queer in my language, in Amharic, and I think that experience of the taboo of queerness has really affected like that sort of process of identity development for me, and really the lack of socialization. Like cultural scripts are very heteronormative and very like based in tradition and based in like doing things for the family and for the culture. And family is an expansive word in my culture. It means an extension of a network of community, right? And so for me, my experience of learning these social scripts as it pertains to queerness was late. I didn't realize that I was queer until much later because I didn't see any queer Ethiopians, and I just thought, oh, that must not be an option. And so the process of learning has been really an engaging in community and engaging in community outside of my cultural experience, which can be isolating at times, but finding people who can commiserate and finding other queer people of color who can understand the perspective from which I come, and like finding out like what it looks like to have relationships with these identities and maintain a connection to a base of cultural understanding that I also still feel so strongly connected to and really informs my viewpoint in the world. So I'm not sure if that answers the question as specifically, but definitely informs my like experience in queerness and in relationships.
Thank you.
I'll hop in. I'm Leen, they, them. I identify as genderqueer, and then in terms of sexual identity, as queer as well. My primary socialization included no reference to gender or to discerning gender or sexual identity. This was like 2000s-ish, and I was taught sex education from a nurse at a single-sex Catholic school. It's considered a progressive Catholic school, which doesn't say a lot for, in terms of sex education curriculum, but even teaching something like contraception was controversial. And so it wasn't really a space to consider, a safe space to consider gender identity. So a lot of that exploration took place in college. But yeah, I would definitely say my social scripts did not include any mention of it. So it made it a very difficult process because there were no examples.
I'm Katherine, she, her. I identify as a cisgendered lesbian. I just want to pick up on some of the wonderful things that I've already heard from the other panelists about this idea of options and things we don't get to know or see when we're younger in certain spaces. I too grew up, with Catholic family, Catholic schools, and Esette said something very interesting to me about options and knowing these things can be an option for you, and how I hope things have changed, but this idea of there are options and there are these values put on the options, even when you've identified there are options for other people out there, and how part of this panel discussion, my hope is for all the 29 attendees I see but can't see, is thinking about how we can remove any, I know it's the next question, but the barriers to what young people think of as a good option, an all right option to be me as I'm going to be, because there was that option there, but that was for other people, and I knew that that was kind of coded as wrong, the way that I grew up and all of the systems around us. So thinking about how we can open up those spaces to see life as options and know that these options are equally good options. And how we can, I know this gets into the next question, but how we can support all of us educators here, counselors here, everybody, that they're all good options.
I'm M. I pronouns are they, them, and I too would just want to echo a lot of the same sentiments, particularly around options. Just to share my social location for context, I'm a white, queer, non-binary, working class disabled person who grew up in rural West Virginia in generational poverty with a very conservative Methodist family. In many ways, that environment was restrictive, with prescribed gender roles and expectations around sexuality when I was a teen. And I didn't have access to comprehensive sex ed or alternative representations of gender and sexuality. I only had the experiences of family to compare, and there just weren't openly queer and trans folks in my community when I was growing up. So it was difficult to imagine any other way of existing in that space because I didn't know there were other ways of being. And that goes back to the ideas Dr. Peters discussed about, social scripts and socialization by passing it down. And I just didn't have access to that. And I internalized all of that to mean that something was wrong with me, that my experience was abnormal and invalid, and I needed to perform my identity in specific ways just to survive. But on the other hand, I think that growing up in that particular context was liberating for me. It allowed me room to play with my gender, even if only in private, and to explore what felt right for me and discard any pieces that didn't fit for me. And it taught me how to survive in environments that weren't all that safe or welcoming for me. And that's been an invaluable lesson I've carried with me throughout my life. I've learned to build my own chosen family, and that's largely what has made me the resilient person I am today. So overall, I'd say personally, I had a pretty mixed experience growing up queer and non-binary in rural Appalachia.
Thank you. So the next question I want to ask our wonderful panelists today are, what are some of the prominent supports, barriers, or even stressors in regards to kind of sexual health and wellness for the various queer communities?
I think what comes to mind initially is the lack of comprehensive sex education and really like information about queerness and about sexual health as it pertains to being queer or transgender, gender expansive. That information is not necessarily available in the context of school or education. And I think maybe a support would be its availability or accessibility in other types of spaces like social media, really um, like queer youth may engage in like a search for this information and finding it within blogs or within particular social media platforms, creating community and sharing like information in almost like an oral tradition or a written tradition through these methods, but really like this information not always being as accurate if it's not like conveyed for their particular experience, or the information not being as comprehensive might be a barrier in that instance.
Yeah, I agree with that, and also I keep thinking about people as both support or barrier. The people around young adolescents who are LGBTQ plus, don't know they're LGBTQ plus, all adolescents kind of are our supports or barriers in terms of what messages you're getting from the people around you. And that includes your parents and your friends, but also administrators, people in the school, teachers, counselors, everyone, staff, faculty, everybody, in terms of, are there displays that LGBTQ plus individuals are welcome here? Do you speak out on it? Do you normalize, sharing your pronouns? Or what are the markers that you're giving to folks that this is a supportive environment? And what are markers that are getting sent to people that there are barriers here? And young people are savvy and intuitive about knowing which is which, or feeling it. So how can we be supports and call out barriers when we see them loudly and try to bring them down?
I might like to add, I think of three things: education, medical care, and shame. You covered in your presentation so beautifully about education. I'd really like to have a copy of the presentation. I was writing notes, but and my kids' high school education has had zero sex education, not even thinking of queer-based sexual health, etc. But shame, I think about literally life and death, and that needs to be, it needs to be brought up in this discussion, is that especially trans people of color are still dying and being murdered in this country, which is such an abomination. And the opposite of shame is affirmation. But medical care, I just think it's important to recognize that most people who are still living at home are likely to be seeing their parents' physicians. And if you think about the type of doctor that your parents had that maybe you went to, would you have been comfortable in talking to them about anal sex, or any questions relating to something that doesn't fit within that perfect cis white etc. box? I think what we're lacking is whole person care for queer youth who are needing to learn, and I believe that some of these discussions could really be taking place with medical care providers, especially for youth in environments where there aren't resources. Maybe they can't talk with their parents, but at least they're getting to see a physician, or a coach or an administrator, like you had mentioned, to get some direction. The other thing I would like to say is that, I don't know if it's relevant to this question, but I know at my kids' school, there are 2 classrooms out of a 1,000-person high school where one teacher has put a rainbow flag on their door, and there are a couple of others that have safe space stickers, which sounds great. But in chatting with some of those educators at the high school level, they have no idea how to handle some of the issues that certainly my kid might want to come to them for. And so that's something that is a huge nut to crack for our youth.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to jump in on that in terms of, I appreciated their reference to medical care too. There's so much gatekeeping in terms of gender affirming care that exists, whether it's legislation specifically, like in Massachusetts, they require insurances to cover gender affirming care, but in Tennessee, it is completely excluded from Medicaid. And so, and then beyond that, just wait times and distance and the co-payments that exist. There's so many barriers in that sense. Not to mention if a child is not out to their parents in any capacity of how do they access that care.
I will say something, and if anyone else would like to add, please do so. If not, we can transition to our next question. I think it's also important to consider mental health professionals, and I appreciate Darren's talking about medical professionals, but I think for also mental health professionals as well, looking at the policies practices. When I was practicing in California, providing mental health services, I predominantly worked with queer adolescents and youth, as well as queer couples. And in California at the time, it has been amended since, the rules of reporting for sexual abuse, which was any anal or oral under the age of 18 had to be reported. So you're looking at any queer person who is engaging any type of sexuality. I was required by my profession and the laws of California to then report queer individuals. And so then that presents as a professional and ethical kind of conundrum. I didn't report and could have been held liable and responsible for that, but looking at how some of our own policies and practices, if not critically examined, can create a lot of harm. Particularly if we're looking at people who are in non-affirmative families or spaces who then family members or caregivers are going to find out, which can lead to homelessness, it can lead to abuse, it can lead to increased rates of suicide ideation. So looking at the harm that can come from that. And then lastly, to also consider that just because a queer space is present and identified as being safe doesn't make it space. When I was in high school, it was called GSA at the time. The only thing that existed was because a family of queer person whose person was beat to an inch of their life, and their family sued the school district, and the courts ruled that if they needed to, they were trying to get an like LGBT GSA in place, and the school's like, no, we're not going to do that. And the courts identified that they could either like support all sports, and so all sports were clubs and stuff, if as long as it followed the proper protocol and process, or they could defund all kind of groups and support groups. So they created a GSA and was taught and facilitated by a very anti-LGBT person, and became a space where actually if queer people showed up, they were bullied or harassed. And so looking at how there was a space that actually wasn't a space. Anything else before we move on to our next question? Oh, okay. My next question is, what advice would you give to school, family, or community leaders about kind of queer adolescent mental health, dating, and sexuality?
I'd love to jump into that one. My advice is don't just look at the literature. The literature can be a couple years behind the culture, and what I mean by that is like peer-reviewed articles and that are published in journals. There's so much great sex education that's actually taking place on TikTok. And if you choose to follow people who are sex educators, gender expansive, they do provide a lot of the curriculum that is missing. And it's really accessible for teens, young adults. So be creative in where you look for that information. And I think like the Human Rights Campaign and GLSEN, they both have youth ambassadors. So there's a lot of material, blogs, published videos by those youth, and those are great educational resources as well.
You can go, Katherine.
I insist.
Oh, okay. If you do. I was just going to talk about like really thinking about intersections of identity when like working with youth in any of these contexts. I think there's an article that I read about like for and by campaigns, which are like where there's like sex education provided for people by people who within those communities, and like finding ways in which to sort of hire, enlist, create diverse panels or diverse educators, diverse spaces where leadership and leadership mirrors the community. I think that's really essential in providing education or providing community spaces um, um, for adolescents that is affirming of identity in whatever spectrum and intersection of those spectrums that they exist within. And like, I think the other thing that I'm really thinking of is like the taboo that existed in my community, my family, like really thinking about how um to break taboos down, really think about like history of colonization and how that's really affected particular communities' experience of queerness, um and doing some of that critical work within family and community.
Yeah, those are all great points, and I'm thinking when I heard this question, it made me think about universal design, which is something within the disability community, allies of people who work with educators, kind of think about universal design in terms of how to include people. And universal design is good for everybody, no matter who you are. Thinking about how to include everybody in education is good across the board for education and everyone's education. And that made me think about applying that to also having these conversations for with everyone. So not just if you're, I don't know, a school counselor and you have the conversation only with the queer identified youth, and that's the only time you have that conversation, or that's the only time you stop to educate yourself about it. But thinking about this all the time and having these conversations as an open part about sexuality with everyone, because not everyone's going to be identified to themselves, to you, if you're in positions working with you. So just thinking about normalizing these conversations and inclusive conversations, not just kind of heterosexual sex conversations, if those are even happening and those are included. So how can we bring universal design in terms of this LGBTQ plus conversation as well?
Any other thoughts from our panelists?
Something I see a lot of is adult mental health providers trying to create and structure groups and like certain clubs and supportive spaces for youth, around mental health. And a lot of those spaces just not being able to continue, not growing, not serving the need that they're really intended for. And so something that I think is really important is to have adults support youth in creating those spaces for themselves. So making sure that those processes of, designing these spaces and determining the purpose of these particular spaces is really a youth-driven and youth-led process.
I'd like to just respond to that briefly. It's so important that you've all said that. We, in fact, in participation with a study that GW did with Rainbow Families, embarked on a massive survey of the queer community. One of those things is that we really don't have an overall effective LGBTQ center or space, one especially that will help provide all of these services for youth, which are often, there are several wonderful needed organizations for those in crisis, but especially in DC, but also opportunities to find modeling of celebration of queer families and like you had mentioned the need for positive statistics, and those are also important that we're sharing those with adolescents and youth. And the other thing that I wish as a parent of a queer youth is that I could see or perhaps affect some change in peer and bystander projects. so that people can learn how to identify and how to speak up in the most effective ways. And you know, allies are a particularly vital part of this process for our youth.
Thank you for that. Connected to that, I will kind of ask the last question for our panel today, which builds upon that is, if you were to give a piece of advice to mental health professionals or educators or related stakeholders regarding how parents, caregivers, guardians can support queer youth and their own dating and sexuality, what is a kind of piece of advice that you would give to them?
What's coming to mind initially is like a home base, like a secure, safe base of operation, essentially, like a place where from which like queer adolescents and queer youth can explore and be liberated, right? Like they can find community outside of home and be truly exploratory in that way and find relationships, dating, find who and how they are, but also be able to find a space at home that feels safe and can address like the potential difficulty in living in a cis normative and heteronormative world, and having that can be particularly grounding and securing for youth as they're also encountering like this duality of experience of just like existing queer and in this like dominant world.
I would also say to the adults kind of to explore their own biases within and outside of the community, allies, everybody thinking about, you know, there might be people who think, oh, I get this is okay, but I would never want my child to be X, or oh, I'm okay, you know, whatever your bias is, but really go within yourself, see what's there and work on being a person who people are comfortable coming to. Part of our earlier discussion about this, as you know, as counselors and people, we think about wanting to create safe spaces, and that idea of we don't get to decide what's a safe space for our clients or the students or whoever it is. The person gets to decide what's safe, but how can we make sure that we've done the work to make ourselves as safe a space as possible for people.
I think something that has been important to me in my work with families is to operate from the assumption that families love their children and want them to have a good life. I think it's really important to be able to view family behaviors not as, you know, isolated incidents, but as something that is occurring in a cultural context, and that these behaviors are often aimed at socializing children to be adaptable and successful within a cis heteronormative society. So these behaviors ultimately come from a place of protection and care. And what's key to this work is to help families examine how their behaviors and reactions invalidate youth, and then work with them to build their own communication skills to help youth feel supported and loved rather than, you know, misunderstood or rejected by their family. And to encourage parents to work on responding rather than reacting to their children. I think what's critical really here is helping parents to separate their personal feelings about having a queer or trans child from their child's need for love and safety and support. Because families that aren't accepting can still support their children and decrease their rejecting behaviors to protect their kids from harm.
I would love to echo that in some of the training that we do with families and parents with queer kids is we have a model that says it's not all about you. And that is really poignant and difficult. Look, even as a queer parent, the coming out process for our queer kid, which should one would have presumed would have been a slam dunk. It wasn't. It was a process for them. And the other thing that I wanted to mention to this as a non-mental health professional, kind of peering in from the outside almost, is to say, and this was addressed a bit earlier, the data is changing like weekly. Not quite weekly, but it's changing so rapidly. And so studies from 2019, from 2017, talk to queer youth, and you'll know exactly what is really going out there. I just recently learned that Twitter is the new place to find, porn. It's just, it's crazy. And as a parent, you trying to navigate all of that, but the landscape is changing every day.
I think if I have one piece of advice, it would be asking for educators, parents to immediately affirm pronouns and names that are offered by an adolescent. I think it's an honor if somebody says, "You get to know me this way." It might not be something that everybody in their life, in that person's life, gets. And so if somebody shares their aligned pronouns and names with you, use them, and also ask what settings they're comfortable with them being used. So you might be an educator, and that might be their aligned name and pronouns might be something that they want you to use in school, but not with their parents. And so it's really important to know the boundaries on that and how you can best support them. And you should be asking as well. So.
I want to thank all of our wonderful panelists for today. The last thing I'll say is we live in a time in which there's not an excuse to not be able to. You have access to information at the tips of your fingers for many people who are working with queer adolescents and youth. So there are resources. You just have to do the work, and it is your job and responsibility. It's not the youth's job and responsibility to take care of that. So I just want to thank all of our presenters today for your time, energy, and enriching the queer community and those who are seeking to be allies and supports to our queer youth as they explore their dating and sexuality and sexual health. So I'm very grateful for each and every one of you, and that I'm happy to stay on later if there's any questions, concerns, but I believe that will wrap up, and I will turn it over to Dr. Wright, who was very kind to invite us to engage here today.
No, thank you, Dr. Peters, and thank you to all our panelists for what was a wonderful conversation. Dr. Peters, you're going to have to let us have access to those slides because I've gotten several DM messages about the wonderful information there. And I'm hoping our panelists can come back. I think a lot of what we've talked about today deserves some diving in. It was a lot laid out on the plate and maybe some unpacking, including the evolution of social media as the Supreme Court now is dealing with outside of classroom speech with youth, and how that affects sort of human development and the intersectionalities of the different ways of using queerness with Blackness, with disability, with transgenderness, and et cetera. So wonderful conversation. Thank you all for joining, and most importantly, happy Pride. Go out and celebrate. There are many things, and I'm sure there are many struggles, but through our struggles, we try to come together with unity to move forward. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.